Hi, in this video I'm going to be making two contrasting baby dresses using this new look pattern number 6254. You'll need the pattern pieces for styles A and B. I'm going to be using pattern pieces number 1, the bodice front, number 2, the bodice back, number 3, the skirt front, and number 4, the skirt back. I'm cutting this out in size number 1 because I've actually made this dress before, but you can obviously choose whichever size you want to make the dress in. So here are our two contrasting fabrics. One is going to have this blue skirt and one is going to have this floral skirt. And then we'll do a contrasting bodice for each one. Okay, so I have washed, dried and ironed my fabric in half, and I've pinned my skirt front and my bodice front on the fold, and then I've pinned my skirt back and my bodice back directly onto the fabric because we are going to want separate pieces, and those are not done on the fold. Then if you have a look at the pattern piece, it tells you need to cut 2 of the fabric and 2 of the lining, which means we need to cut this out once and then transfer it further up on the material and then cut it out again. So in the end we can have 4 of those pieces, and we're going to do the same for the bodice front. I've sorted the pieces into the sections where they belong. So on the side we're going to have this blue bodice with this floral skirt, and on this side we're going to have the floral bodice with the blue skirt. And then of course the contrast of this one will be blue and the contrast of this one will be floral. Now using a 1.5 centimeter seam, which is basically what is required for the entire pattern, you're going to join all your bodice pieces together at the shoulders. And then what you need to do is open each piece out, take it over to the iron and press down the section where they join. So our bodice backs are now joined to our bodice fronts at the shoulder seams, and our seam is being pressed, and I have matched each piece together, right sides together, and pinned them ready to be sewn. And when you sew, you're going to want to sew along the back edge, around the neck and along the second back edge, and then you're going to want to sew around each of the armholes and leave the rest open for now. And of course we want to do the same to both sections. I just wanted to show you what it looks like sewn. Our armholes are sewn, our neck area is sewn, the back of each bodice is sewn, and the other armhole. Taking a pair of scissors, I'm just going to snip over 1/2 centimeter off of each of the seams where I've sewn. So I've snipped away at the seams around all the edges that I've sewn, and I'm just going to take a pair of scissors and start snipping away at the material in those curved sections. But I just want to show you on the corners where you get this diamond shape, we want to snip that in a diagonal, obviously being careful not to snip where the stitches join. You just want to snip ahead of that and take that corner off, and we want to do that on this side as well, same thing. And then around the neck and armholes, I'm going to snip very, very carefully, trying not to snip the stitches, little notches all the way along that outer edge. Okay, so now that all my neck and arm areas have been snipped, you can see what that looks like here. I'm going to now turn the fabric right side out, and I'm going to do that by pulling the fabric through at the neck area, and I'm just going to encourage it and push and push and pull on the fabric until it turns right side out, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm just going to create more of a right angle on these points by pressing from the inside out with a pair of scissors. Okay, so we've pressed our bodices into their shape, and of course this will be the one bodice with the floral on the outside, and this will be the other bodice with the floral on the inside. We're going to join our bodices together at the underarm. So we're going to take the top section here, right sides together, and match it with this bottom section. There's notches where you've cut the fabric, and those should match up. I'm just going to do that, and then we're going to sew right across the top, sealing that whole section together. I do recommend that you pin the two sections together before you sew, because we want to make sure that our seam lines meet as exact as possible, like so. And I find if you just pin that down the middle, then when you sew it, it should work itself out. Our bodices are now sewn together under the arms on all four sections of our bodices, and these are now ready to be sewn onto our skirts, so we can go ahead and start working on that. So I've taken the skirt front and I'm going to match it to one section of our skirt back by joining up the notches as indicated, and we're going to match those right side together, and then sew our 1.5 centimeter seam. And then of course I'm going to take the second section of back skirt and I'll do the same with that, matching those side seams. The side seams are sewn on both of our skirts, and we're going to concentrate now on the back center seam. Because the back of the dress is going to have a zip, you'll find you've got a little notch where the skirt pieces meet, and the bottom of our zip is going to end just above those two notches. So we're only going to want to sew from the bottom up to just below those two notches. I've sewn up the seam to just below those two notches I was talking about earlier, and we're going to want to make this section quite strong because the dress will be open and closed here quite a bit, and so we need to do a locking stitch in order to give the top of the seam just a little bit more strength than usual, and we do that by running the stitches back and forward a few times. Just concentrating on our side seams of the skirt now. We're going to do the same thing as we did with the bodice, and we're going to snip away just over 1/2 centimeter of that seam. I don't have an overcast stitch or a serger, so I've just used a regular zigzag stitch and run it along the edge of my side seams just to tidy them up. Of course I've done that to both sides and on both skirts. Okay, so I found my back center seam, and I'm not going to overcast or do anything with that seam just yet. We're going to leave it for now. But if you have a look at the top, you'll see there are 2 notches on either side of the back center seam. And what I'm going to do now is run a gather stitch, which is basically just the longest straight stitch on your machine, all the way along the top of the skirt until I get back to the other notch. But we only want to gather between those notches. Before I begin gathering the top of my skirt, I'm going to change the thread from the color I'm using, which at the moment is blue, to a completely different color. This will make it easy to see the gather stitch when I come to remove it later on in the project. So I've run my gather stitch along the top of the skirt, and you can see it clearly because I've used that different color thread. And now what I'm going to do is just take the one end of that gather thread and I'm going to pull it so that it gathers up the material like so. And I'm just going to keep pulling on it and then pushing those gathers further and further down the material until the entire circumference of the skirt is gathered. So the top of my skirt is gathered, and I'm going to work on the bodice section, and I'm just going to open it out and find that side seam or that underarm seam, and I'm going to make sure that these sections are flattened, and then I'm going to join those seams up, make sure that they match on both sides like so, and then I'm going to pin that into place, and of course I'll do that on the other arm as well. So this is now ready to be attached to the skirt, so I'm going to attach them right sides together, and I'm going to my center back seam again of the skirt, and I'm going to find that notch that we sewed between earlier. I'm going to match that notch with the notch, the first notch on the edge of the bodice, right sides together like so, and I'm going to pin that into place like that. And then I'm going to find the side seam of my skirt. There, that's the side seam of my skirt, and I'm going to find where they join, and I'm going to match that with the underarm seam of my bodice where I've just pinned, and make sure that those seams are running straight down the side of the dress like so. And then I'm going to pin that entire section into place like that. I'm a bit stubborn. And I'm going to take the pin I put in earlier in the bodice out because that's now held firmly in place. And I'm going to continue along the top of the skirt and find the next notch. It's over here, and the next notch on the top of, on the bottom of the bodice. And I'm going to match those two notches together, and I'm going to pin that into place. And then I'm going to search for the next notch along, the third notch, and again on the bottom of the bodice, and I'm going to match those together and then pin that into place as well. I can find a pin. And just as before, we find the second side seams on the bodice as well as the skirt, and we match those seams as much as possible to each other. Like so, and we'll pin that entire section into place. And again, we're going to remove the pin we put in earlier on the bodice, and then we should be at our final notch on the center seam of the skirt, and we're going to match that, the final notch, on our bodice and pin that in place like so. Just look inside our skirt, and as we sew the skirt onto the bodice, as we sew, we're just going to make sure that our gathers are nice and evenly distributed between the first notch and the side seam and the second notch and the third notch and the side seam and the side seam and the final notch. And here we have an almost finished dress, and I have gone and removed the red gathering stitch from around the edge of the bodice, and I'm going to just turn this inside out, and then I'm going to work on installing the zip on the back of the dress. I've taken an iron and just pressed the back seam flat on the back of the dress, on that open section, and I've pressed down the back of the dress so that the seam is flat all the way down the bottom. With right sides together, I've used a basting stitch to sew down the back seam, and I've used this different color thread again because we're going to take that out after we've installed the zipper. And then I've just used the iron as well to press that seam flat. It's completely up to you how you want to install the zipper. I like to baste the zipper down onto the seam, if I can get the zip undone. Some people like to leave the zip done up. I like to do it section by section, so I will baste this zip down onto the seam and then just use a zipper foot on the machine to sew up the edge of it. I've used the machine to sew the zipper on. It's now attached to the dress, and you can see are these little red stitches where I've hand sewn this zipper on just to hold it in place while I sewed it with the machine. And I'm just going to use the seam ripper to take those stitches out. I'm just using my seam ripper to open up the back of the dress and remove those red basting stitches that I put in earlier. Your final step with the back of the dress is to just add a little hook and eye, which I've done here, you can see. And then I also just hand stitch along the edge and top of that back seam just to hold it in place and stop it from flipping out. To finish off the back, you just want to cut down that back seam, the closed section, and overcast the top of that. Now all that's left to do is to hem up the bottom of both of your skirts and you're done. I hope you've enjoyed sewing with me. My name is Gillian. Thanks for watching.